These systems we don't believe are broken. We think that they're overloaded, and we think we found a way to sort of reboot those systems.
Hey friends, and welcome to Currently the Conversation. It's brought to you by TVC Cherry Capital Airport, your Northern Michigan connection. I'm Christal Frost, and today's episode is one of those conversations that I think a lot of us need right now. Because whether you're a parent or a teacher or a coach or a social worker, or you're just a human trying to hold it together, this question comes up eventually. How do we build resilience? And not in that Pinterest quote kind of way, like in the real world, like on a Tuesday when someone is dysregulated, when the system is stressed, when the kid is acting out, when we're acting out, when the systems meant to help are so overwhelmed or under-resourced. And today my guests are Chip and Lisa St. Clair, and their work through the Clair Butterfly Foundation is all about going beyond behavior management and getting to what's underneath. And I want to say a quick note. We're going to be talking about childhood trauma in a general way, no graphic details, but just take care of yourself while you listen. So first of all, I have to say to both of you, we had a conversation prior to recording this, and I have been thinking about it ever since. I am just so excited about talking more about what you guys do, about who you are as individuals, and as this dynamic force that is bringing this into our area. So welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
I'm really grateful that you're here. And for anyone maybe meeting you for the first time, what do you wish that people understood about you, each of you, that doesn't show up when you Google or you look at a headline or a bio? Let's start with you, Chip.
That I want to leave this world a better place than when I found it.
Yeah.
That means a lot to me.
And how about you?
That people are very resilient, and with the right tools, they can be the very best versions of themselves.
Wow, those are two really great ones. I really I want to talk about the St. Clair Butterfly Foundation, which is a foundation that you founded, and explain in your words what exactly it is, because we're going to be covering a lot of ground today, and people are going to be learning a lot about this mission. But what do you think, in your words, that St. Clair Butterfly Foundation is? How about you, Lisa?
St. Clair Butterfly Foundation is the voice for those who need to feel heard and valued and really cared about.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. We really work to strengthen systems from within. And, we have 4 ecosystems we focus on, education, justice, including juvenile justice, law enforcement, prosecuting attorneys' offices, behavioral health, including healthcare, and then community. And across those systems, we've noticed sort of a drastic dysregulation. These systems we don't believe are broken. We think that they're overloaded, and we think we found a way to sort of reboot those systems, allow the programs that are working within them to function better, and the adults and those they serve, those young people they service within those systems to get regulated and improve outcomes.
Dysregulation is one of those words that I think people think of as very clinical, but we've all experienced it, right? Can you explain what dysregulation means?
Yeah, for sure. So, we can talk about it in terms of stress, chronic stress, and then, of course, trauma, right? Dysregulation just means you're not in your executive function. When we think of the brain in 3 parts, the amygdala, the back of our brain near the brainstem, the limbic system is sort of in the middle, which handles all of our emotions. And then the front of our brain, where our forehead is more of our executive functioning, and that's our prefrontal cortex. And when we're reacting, we're in our amygdala. That's our survival brain, and that's meant to protect us. If we were being chased by a lion, you want to be in your amygdala to be able to fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Hopefully you fight back or you run in that situation. But unfortunately, we're presented with so many opportunities in this life that create so much chronic stress and trauma, especially childhood trauma, that put us in our amygdala. And what's supposed to protect us is actually dysregulating us and making it where we're not functioning properly in general society.
Yeah, I know that it used to be kind of called the lizard brain, right? Like, because that's the first part of our brainstem that started to, develop, and that it is that reactionary. And if you've had that chronic sort of trauma or stress or those experiences, you're not able to think executively, right? You're not using those critical thinking skills because you are in survival mode. When I'm reading about your materials with the St. Clair Butterfly Foundation, what stands out is this idea that you're not just trying to manage a behavior, right? So we think about behaviors, and I always think and equate to behaviors with like children, right? You think about a behavior and you try to manage that behavior, correct the behavior. You're going to point out the behavior and try to, fix some portion of it. But what you're trying to do is address the story that is driving the behavior, the why, and not the, what is wrong with you. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and so we have 3 core principles, and it really comes down to understanding brain states and really respecting the process, because we all have built-in protective mechanisms. So first of all, most importantly, would be protection precedes learning. And so when an individual feels safe, that is only when they can be in their executive function and they can start processing things.
Yeah.
The second core principle is regulation precedes correction.
Yes.
And so often in our ecosystems, we see the behavior and we're reacting, and we're, just thinking that we can get them to just stop by saying stop or forcing them to do something. And when actually, if we can get them to pay attention to their body, their brain state, their breathing, their emotional awareness is what we really focus on. At that point, they can then be accountable for their behavior. So,
but only at that point,
only
really.
at that point,
right?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then the final principle would be connection precedes compliance.
Oh, okay.
Right. So when they can feel connected to somebody, and you establish that that foundation of trust, then there is such an opening to them really wanting to make change. And agency is really the only thing that sustains. So when someone has agency, then they're the chances for them to be that best version of themselves is exponentially greater.
It feels like this is not necessarily like a new idea, but the way that you put it all together with, your focuses and, your values and everything else, it really is unique.
Yeah.
And I think another piece of this is addressing the lived experience that is, kind of a part of why I think the both of you decided to start this foundation. And, with your permission, Chip, I'd love to talk a little bit about your personal story, which is part of the reason, part of the reason that you are who you are. It shaped the work. And obviously, Lisa, you were around for a lot of it. And I want to honor your privacy. So please only share what feels appropriate. But why don't we talk about your lived experience and your own survival story?
No, absolutely. And, first, let me say, as our regional director of Michigan, Whitney Amon would say, everything happens for a purpose.
Right.
And when we talked earlier about dysregulation, and we talked about the trauma that can come, that can create dysregulation, sort of living out of that survival brain, the lizard brain, that was a daily occurrence in my life. I grew up with extreme trauma. If anyone's familiar listening today or watching today with what an ACE test is, or an ACE assessment, it sort of gives a questionnaire 1 through 10 of different various
adverse childhood experiences, right?
Exactly. And it could be all sorts of different experiences, including dysfunction at home, community violence, divorce, and sort of this cumulative assessment, starts to rank. And we know from the data shows us a score of 4 or higher, for example, you're 80 times more likely to suffer from depression.
Yep.
You're 2.5 times more likely to suffer from a stroke. So it's not only a sort of emotional or a psychological effect. It can have a true biological effect on you later in life. Well, my ACE score would have been a 10, 10 out of 10. And my father was incredibly brutal. My mother was an alcoholic and offered no support. So my escape was into the arts and literature. So that was really the way I tried to cope with my world.
You mentioned that escape, and I think it's really interesting because that sort of escape started to build some resilience for you too, which is, another core foundation of the St. Clair Butterfly Foundation, where you find those pieces. Maybe they're a part of your survival, but they make you, they become something about you that follows you through the entirety of your life. I wonder what the moment was during that time. And obviously, when you're a child, you are in survival mode. When you have a traumatic upbringing, and I will share personally, I have some very similar one. That you are just sort of surviving. It's just like a day to day, and you might not even know it. It's just like kind of one of those things that I think back on it now, and I'm like, what was I doing? Like, how did I do that? But there's a moment in your story, or a season even, when you realize that what you survived could maybe be translated into something else. And when did that happen for you, Chip, when you realized that your story, your survival, could become something that would help others heal?
Yeah. It was really I guess you'd call it a series of unfortunate events that occurred. Having dealt with everything from my father throwing me at 8 years old out of a rowboat into Lake Michigan and rowing away, leaving me there, and having poetry in my mind, a poem called Invictus that was really special to me, means unconquerable in Latin. And that the last lines are, I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. That really became a mantra for me. And, growing up, we always lived in the Southeast Michigan area, but we moved all around the country. And around high school age, we moved back to the Southeast Michigan area, where we ended up in a little town called Lathrop Village. A few years later, when I was 17, I was a senior at Southfield Lathrop High School. I met this amazing woman named Lisa 34 years ago.
Wow.
And never met a woman so strong, resilient, compassionate, good-hearted. And, it seemed that she saw more in me than I even saw in myself. And it was after dating for 6 years. And then in 1998, when we were both 22, Lisa just celebrated her 22nd birthday. We were at my parents' apartment celebrating, and a dinner table argument turned violent. My dad dislocated my shoulder. Lisa called the police. He was arrested. And it was that night that we found out he was actually one of America's most wanted fugitives. My father was an escaped child murderer who had stomped a 3-year-old to death back in 1970 in Indiana. Went to prison, and the woman who had become my mother helped him escape Indiana State Prison back in 1973. And so my entire life was spent on the run.
Wow.
Never knowing my parents were fugitives. And so that understanding and realization obviously was one thing, but really being able to unwind the effects of the trauma, being able to decide every day to not become my father, because we know these sorts of behaviors and these cycles are, these things are cycles, can be cyclical unless you break that cycle, which I'm, very happy that you did as well, Christal, in your world. But with Lisa's love and support and my grounding in the arts, we decided to do something to make this world a better place.
Can I ask just one question about that that day, celebrating the 22nd birthday? And Lisa, you coming from a point of this is wrong and this is what you do when something is wrong. You call the police. And Chip, you growing up in that environment, was there ever a moment where you went, like a light bulb went off and you went, oh, really? We can do that? Yeah,
my whole life, we had police called to our house. Neighbors had heard things. Of course, this was the 70s, 80s, 90s, and it wasn't as prevalent to really do anything about domestic violence. You just kind of let families handle it internally. And so this was a moment when Lisa called the police. I can honestly say I wouldn't have.
Yeah.
I would have been probably in that same situation the next day. It was just another day in my life. Lisa's courage to be able to do that really pulled me out of that entire dynamic and allowed me to say, wait a minute, maybe this isn't normal.
Yeah. And there's, the trauma that we carry, often has shame with it. I always kind of call it like you have this sort of carry-on bag and it's full of shame. And it doesn't actually belong to you. It's not actually something that it's ever your fault. But when you've been experiencing trauma, it's really hard to separate that. And it's also hard to separate like what happened to me from who I am. Can you talk a little bit about, both of you in this experience, a catalyst for wanting change being personal experience, but also being to separate yourselves from what happened to who I am?
Yeah, and that's interesting that you say that because where the arts were an escape for Chip, they were a way of life for me, and really just something I counted on and maybe took for granted, and I had my home was such a safe place for me where I knew I could talk to my parents about anything. And it doesn't mean that it was perfect. I had siblings, but there were boundaries, there were rules, there was trust, and I was taught to respect my body and others as well. And when there's so much dysfunction in a home, that line is so blurred, and you don't know what actually protecting yourself is. And like you said, you don't even identify that you're in a dangerous situation. You're actually you're surviving, and so that Chip calls me brave or courageous, and I actually just feel very fortunate that I had a good home that provided me those safeties where I didn't even think twice. This was behavior that was unacceptable, and it was frightening, and I called the police. That's what you're supposed to do if something happens like that. Right. I didn't think twice. And I think what came out of all of this was that I realized oftentimes people are not necessarily making, they're not using critical thinking, and they're not making conscientious choices. They're just defaulting to what's comfortable.
Right.
And that is really the barrier to us being able to communicate effectively, to be able to connect with one another, and to see real lasting change.
Yeah, absolutely. And like a lot of the work that you had to do personally, and then of course professionally, is to understand that this foundation was built on some lived experience, but it is beyond your story, right?
It is.
It is. I do want to mention about the memoir that you wrote, The Butterfly Garden, which of course the Butterfly Foundation, the foundation references that pain into purpose. What do you do? What do you hope someone will feel when they hear your story? And I know that's kind of a loaded question because, I think that's often asked of people who have survived things. And it puts responsibility on you in a way where you're like, well, I don't want to be responsible for what you will feel. But what is your hope that people take away from not just your story, but your pain into purpose arc?
Thank you for that question. It actually is a very, very important one because, when I wrote The Butterfly Garden, it's actually our story, although my name's on it. It is Lisa's story as well. It really chronicles, everything I'd been through, and then of course the transformation I ended up making. But it was a long journey. It took me over 5 years to write this. When you talk about carry-on baggage, I probably had 5 check bags and a carry-on bag worth of guilt and shame, and so there's so much you you have to unpack metaphorically to be able to process everything you've been through. So it actually originally started out as a diarrhea journal for me to process what I had been through. And Lisa provided me sort of that safe space to be able to do that. She said, I'll never read this. I just want you to be able to talk about this. But of course, I wanted to not only get it out, but process it properly. And she helped me do that. And when we ended up getting a publisher and, it coming out in 2008, and then, honored to say it was a bestseller, was incorporated in training of in training for law enforcement prosecutors, social workers all around the country, incorporated in universities for social work department and in master's programs and all sorts of things. We realized the power of the story, and one of the things we never expected was making the impact we did. For me, it was about processing what I had been through. Then when I realized the reaction people had, I realized this book really wasn't about me.
Yeah.
It was about other people being able to see it as a roadmap, hopefully to find their own sense of peace.
And we're here with Kevin Klein, Executive Director of TVC Cherry Capital Airport. And, I'm thinking about the summertime, which I do approximately 99% of the time here in Northern Michigan, right? And it's a good thing we're doing that because now is the time, believe it or not, to plan for summer vacation. Where are we going, Kevin?
So, you've got so many different nonstop destinations to go to in summertime fun. But book now because we got 7 great airlines here. We'll start off with Allegiant, Avelo. We have Sun Country. We have JetBlue. Of course, then you have American, United, and Delta.
Yeah.
So that rounds off all 7 of them. And I think that, they can take you not only anywhere in the country, those 20 nonstop destinations, but it's one stop to the rest of the world.
So many opportunities for all of you to make your summer travel plans right now. Best way to do that is go to
tvcairport.com.
You mentioned a lot of systems in how your memoir has affected those systems. And the bulk of what you're trying to do is systems change. And I love that at the beginning of this conversation, you said you don't think that the systems are broken. You think they're overloaded. And I think that's really important because for a lot of people who work in the systems, that, you immediately get defensive because you're like, I'm trying. Yeah. I'm doing the best I can. Yeah. But I keep seeing like this line in trauma-informed spaces that you move from the concept of what did you do to what happened to you. And that's like going back to your mission of finding the story instead of the behavior. Why is this happening instead of what's wrong with you? That in itself is a systems change. Sure. When you see, though, overloaded systems and adults specifically who are asking the wrong questions, especially for kids. And then you see that shift and they start asking the right questions or they change the way they're asking the questions. What actually changes there? What do you think happens when an adult says to a child, hey, what happened? Instead of, what's wrong with you?
You're so right. Behavior is communication. And the entire energy in the room changes when there's care and true interest and understanding the individual and what they were thinking. And there's a reason for their behavior. And to just honor that moment, not to justify or defend or give any weight,
like excuse,
not to
almost.
excuse it, but just to give them that space in that moment to hear them out. Something changes. They feel heard, seen, trusted, respected.
Yeah.
We don't have to agree with their behavior. We just had to hear about it.
Yeah.
And give them that space. So we've learned that lowers their guard, that gets them into their thinking part of their brain. And then there's room for improvement.
Yeah.
It happens organically.
Yeah, it's not just a softer approach. I mean, it seems like, you're being easy on them by saying, well, what happened to you instead of why did you do this? But, when a dysregulated person, let's take a young person who's been through some sort of chronic stress. Let's say they've had an ACE score of 4 or higher, even a couple or higher, two or higher. Oftentimes chronic stress reduces the volume of the hippocampus.
Yeah.
So the thinking part of the brain does not have the neural pathways to actually make good, healthy, informed decisions. That can be changed, we know, through neuroplasticity, that we can start to reinforce those neural pathways. So right away, we have to sort of have an understanding that when they perceive a threat, it'll go to a nervous system activation, which results in a behavior. And oftentimes, the systems are reacting to that behavior. Our focus is to get before the perceived threat even happens, or even when that nervous system is activated. So when you say, hey, what happened to you? Instead of, why did you do this? Automatically, that young person is now thinking of the question. They're in their prefrontal cortex. You got them out of the amygdala. And so now you can start to have a rational conversation and start to change the behavior.
Yeah. I mean, I know it seems a little trivial, but I think we've all been in those rooms with our siblings. And if mom comes in and says, Christal, what did you do? Instead of, hey, what's going on here? What happened? It takes everybody's involved instead of like, I didn't do anything.
And put your guards up, right?
Yes, you become instantly defensive.
Yes.
Yeah. It changes the whole dynamic.
Well, one of the things I was going to say is, we're working on training local law enforcement, sheriff's department in the northern Michigan region soon. And, one of the things that people don't realize, like take a law enforcement officer, when they walk onto anywhere, they come into a coffee shop, they pull up in front of Myers.
Right.
Everybody is suddenly in their amygdala, like what's going on, what happened. Imagine, we all know we might have gone, let's say, I haven't sped, but other people I know speed.
Yeah.
Go a few miles over the speed limit and you see an officer sitting on the side of the road. You slow down, you get a little panicky, right? Your heart rate increases.
Yeah.
Automatically, they affect the environment just by being present. And so them understanding that, they can actually start to help navigate other people to not be in their reactive brain.
Well, and depending on what kind of experiences those individuals have had with law enforcement, then now it's tied to other perceived threats.
Can you give me an example of like a wrong question that you might hear an adult asking a kid? I mean, I know we've gone through the like, what's wrong with you? Those kinds of things. Any others that stick out? And when you hear them, whether you're hearing them in practice or, I mean, I've even heard things like, I'm in a grocery line and I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
Well, in labeling, I think we just get so used to labeling the behavior.
Yes.
And what we don't realize is when we label that behavior, it kind of almost sticks that individual into that role.
Yeah.
As opposed to, for instance, let's just say the word angry.
Yeah.
Angry is like a secondary emotion. It's not the first.
The first is probably fear, right?
Right, and it could be multi-layered, right, with many different unmet needs. And so when we just by saying, "Why are you so angry?" It puts the guard up. It labels that,
and then that person becomes angry.
That's right, and even more angry, and it just starts. It's like fuel to fire.
Yeah.
So if we can almost break down our communication, and Chip and I learned this even in our relationship, break down the communication and just say what you're actually feeling.
What were some of those right questions? Like, what happened? What's going on? Tell me how you're feeling. Like, are those some right questions that really open that door to building that regulation and trust?
Oh, really? It has. And just being able to recognize in yourself, hold on, I'm dysregulated right now, and, it's not the easiest thing probably to hear when you're on the other side of that argument. It's like, hold on, I'm dysregulated. I want to be able to think properly about my responses and have a mindful approach to whatever we're talking about. And it's interesting because educators are under so much strain, for example, and they'll have dysregulated kids all the time in their classroom. And they got in the profession not to be rich. They got in because they really care about making a difference in the education system. They want to teach. They want to help these young people. They want to connect. But what ends up happening oftentimes is they're so overloaded, they will react to a situation and to the behavior. And when they address that, like Lisa said, with a label, or why are you acting, why are you so angry?
mean?
Yeah.
Why are you being so mean?
Right.
You're
Yeah.
just a bully in the class, or, you're not trying hard enough.
Yeah.
And it's like, you never know what that child just came out of when they came to school.
Yep, absolutely. Have no idea. And when people tell you that you are something, if they tell you enough, you start to believe it,
Sure.
right? If someone says you're bad or you're not good at this or you're X label, you not only start to believe it, you start to embrace it.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of want to just zoom out for a moment and mention too that this kind of training that you all do doesn't just affect kids, right? I mean, when you're training adults, educators, parents, court staff, justice systems, when they're trained to ask the right questions, their jobs get easier. Like that's, at the end of the day, that sort of secondary trauma is going to be lessened from what they're dealing with maybe caseloads full of folks that have experienced trauma, or their conversations are going to go a little more smoothly. They're building trust. They're building their clients are going to be more regulated. Like, it's a win-win for everyone, right?
You're absolutely right. You put in that extra effort initially, and you build such a strong foundation that over time just needs to be maintained. We have different challenges in our lives and in the world, and there's always going to be different things to navigate. But when we have the tools and we have the understanding, when we can look at behavior and not necessarily know exactly what's at the root of it, but just identify it. If someone's in fight, flight, freeze, fawn mode, there's different tools and techniques that you can apply, that you can help them to be able to self-regulate. Them to what's more empowering than someone to have more agency and be able to truly make cognitive, thoughtful decisions.
Yeah. Get them back into that
Right.
that frontal cortex.
Yeah,
right?
it's interesting because you talk about vicarious trauma, and I don't think that's addressed enough. Now, this is the secondary trauma that our frontline workers, including our educators, who went to school for all sorts of things, but not necessarily child development. They're not going to understand. All of a sudden, they're sort of like social workers or counselors to a lot of these kids. And so a lot of them are not prepared when they come in. They're leaning on what they've learned or what they think works or some theories. And, trauma-informed training is good. It really lays the groundwork for being informative, raising awareness. But why we call our sort of framework beyond trauma-informed is it really gives those in-the-moment, real-time tips, tricks, and tools that educators, that law enforcement officers, that prosecutors, probation officers can use in the moment to self-regulate and then help the young people they're working with.
Any more tools for the toolbox, but because we're all realizing this in real time that you are going to be more than a teacher. You're going to be more than a law enforcement officer, more than a caseworker. You really are. Like, unfortunately, more and more people are moving about in this world with lots of trauma, and they are dysregulated. So, you could be the person who is checking someone out at a grocery store, and someone gets dysregulated, and that could impact you. So it's just, you're seeing it a lot more, I think. And I think that's a great way to segue into going back to those 4 pillars of impact. And you talked about this at the start of the show, Chip. The schools and education, we talk a lot about kids, and you've got an education model that goes beyond discipline and focuses on helping students feel differently. So behavior changes can follow. I don't want to say feel differently. What does that mean?
Well, they so through our butterfly labyrinth, which really helps an individual to self-actualize. It's based on Maslow's hierarchy, and it gets them through 7 way stations. We use the word way stations because of butterflies, and that's where they pollinate and make the world a more beautiful place. So as we evolve through this pathway, we first learn breath work. And there's so many different techniques, how to calm ourselves down in the moment, how to regulate, even to sleep better.
Yeah, right.
So it's really tips that we're teaching the educators that then pass that on to their students. Where you come into a classroom, and what would that look like if the first 5 minutes we're teaching the students to, relax and to take breaths where they can reset and reset their vagal nerve, and it changes the entire environment in that classroom.
Gosh, I feel like I need to do that some days.
We all
right?
do, right? We all do.
Well, it's simple, like 13 seconds. Inhale for 4 seconds. You hold it for 2. Exhale for 7. That longer exhale actually, like Lisa said, resets the vagal nerve. And that gets you right in your prefrontal cortex. Imagine every educator in every classroom every morning doing that with their students.
As a routine. And the kids, they look forward to routines.
Yes,
They do. And then we go on to emotional awareness, where they can learn how to name their emotions. And oftentimes, as we talk about in dysfunctional homes, they're not allowed to acknowledge their emotions.
Absolutely.
And maybe not even allowed to, but there's just no space for that. And so it's not so simple. There's not just primary emotions. There's so many emotions that we have. And just being able to name that and validate it, pay attention to it, then we can start working at it, at how to regulate those.
Name
it to tame it. Yeah.
Anyway, then we go to emerge. And that is where we're getting out of our reptilian brain and into our executive function to the owl brain. And it really, we get third graders just being able to say, hold on a second, arms crossed and in the corner, and they're like, I turn around and I'm in my crocodile brain.
Wow.
And I need to get to my owl brain. It's a wonderful moment to see a student who would have reacted aggressively, just non-compliant, all of that, to now paying attention to themselves and recognizing they need to focus on their behavior and how that's affecting the room, right? Yeah.
Just being able to name it, though, it's really interesting when you talk to children, and I think you can kind of point, if there's so many emotions, I mean, I think we've all seen enough of what's the Pixar, the Disney Inside Out. Yes. Where, you start with like kind of these, like, I've got joy and I've got this, but then it gets a little more complicated and a little more complex.
Right?
And I've got anxiety and I have frustration and I have, sorrow and, all these things that are like, I don't understand what that feels like, because if I've only been taught that I can either be happy, sad, or mad, where does everything else fit in?
You're right, and those emotions are normal, and we all have those emotions. And how do we get ourselves into a productive
and
mindset?
it's really building a common language,
right?
When we can have them be able to assign names to some of these things and actually learn words, they feel empowered.
I know you do this with children, like we're talking about right now in schools and education in the classroom, but I know your second pillar is with the juvenile justice courts, and you working in juvenile justice system where the reframe from what did you do to what happened to you is actually everything, because they're usually there because they did something, right?
Yeah.
But if you can step back a few, inches even, and just go, what happened before you did that thing? And most often, these are young people, but not too young. So maybe they haven't gone through the public schools educations, that the system that you guys are doing. Maybe they haven't had the chance to learn emotional regulation and know when they are dysregulation and when they're reptilian or owl, but they're still there and they're still young and their brains aren't fully formed, and they're standing in front of a court, and it could be the end of their life as they know it in some cases. So if you have a justice system that is trained for this, what changes in that moment when staff are trained to recognize those trauma patterns? That could be a huge difference, right?
Yeah. And we've been in juvenile detention facilities, all kinds of spaces where where the professionals just needed that understanding of the neuroscience in relation to the behavior, the appreciation for different groups where they've come from, and knowing that behavior is communication, it's a signal, and it's very empowering. You can, and I think that's part of the process too. Is we really shouldn't be shaming adults in those professions that they're doing the very best they can with what they have. And I think that when we can give them the tools and we can show them exactly what's going on in that the neuroscience behind the behavior, a light goes on, and it's like, oh my gosh, I've been doing this wrong all along, and I need to make a change. We've seen it happen time and time again.
Yeah, we worked in a juvenile detention center in New York, and a lot of these kids had been gang kids. They were incarcerated for all sorts of reasons, and they had actually started a Butterfly Garden book club, and did poetry and artwork and music based on the butterfly. And there's this statistic that over 90% of the adult prison population reports high A scores.
Absolutely.
And that would also stand to reason with these young people. And what a lot of those who work with these young people don't realize, and I think where the light kind of comes on, as you say, is defiance, disrespect, all of these things actually represent a brain state. Defiance is actually flight. They are failing to disengage because they don't know how to deal with being told what to do. Okay. So that when it's flight, or for me, I would escape into a book, right? That was how my flight looked. But when adults, when these professionals can realize and identify fight, flight, freeze, or fawn.
Fawn is important too.
Exactly. All of these brain states, then they know how to address it even better.
And it doesn't mean that we would have just one brain state. At different phases in our lives, we probably have many different states. It's just having the tools to be able to self-regulate.
Do you think that this is I know you work with the juvenile justice populations. Do you think this could work with adult populations as well?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. We're actually in talks with a couple of local sheriff's department about their county jails and those inmates who are on their way out doing some life skills programs based on our Butterfly Labyrinth framework.
I think just even understanding what happened to you can, get you on the path toward healing, right? And if you've been surviving for so long and you're, 60 years old and you just think, well, there's no other option for me, but then somebody tells you that there is. That can be huge. Yeah. I want to get to pillar 3, which is your, tell me about pillar 3. Which is the toolkit. Is that right?
Yeah, our Beyond Trauma Informed toolkit. So it's interesting because we have, what we created was our Beyond Trauma Informed toolkit. And essentially that provides real-time tools for all professionals through professional development that we do.
Oh, yes.
So professional development, as we know, has been around for years and years. Trauma-informed training has been around for years and years. But when you focus first and foremost on vicarious trauma, eyes open, people feel seen and heard. When we're on airplanes and they tell you, the flight attendant says, when the oxygen mask drops, who do you put it on?
You got to put it on yourself first, right?
Exactly. And unfortunately, a lot of our frontline workers, our professionals, our educators are suffocating because they're giving so much to others that they're forgetting to refill their cups.
Well, and it goes against everything that we're taught as well.
Yeah.
To care for ourselves first, right?
Yeah.
But it truly is it's the foundation behind our strength and our ability to be able to help others.
So This feels like, I know we're really talking about people who are on the front lines. We're talking about the court systems. We're talking about, health systems and all sorts of things, but I feel like this is just something that every human could really, really get a benefit out of. Because even like I said, understanding dysregulation, understanding that not everybody is coming, is walking into the world with the same kind of tools. That in itself could make everybody a little kinder. I know that's going to sound a little bit like woo-woo, but I think about this, if you're ever cut off in traffic, and if you switch your mindset from like, dang you, and, expletives and whatever else you're going to be, saying, to like, wow, something must be going on. Maybe you're in a more of a hurry than I am, or whatever, just like that tiny little shift, you don't get all dysregulated and have a lot of emotions. And you also start to see empathy towards someone you've never even met.
Oh, so well said.
Just, something like that. This toolkit could really be used for any profession, anybody.
Yeah. This has just been, people ask, if we could have never had this happen, because it's been a painful journey, what would we change? And I wouldn't change a thing. Yeah. I feel I'm a much better person knowing all of this, and more prepared. And I've devoted my whole life to this academically, and of course our experiences prepared us. But there's just no amount of words to say that when we can use our story to inspire and empower others to be the very best versions of themselves. I know that, when I was in middle school, I was bullied quite a bit. And my mom, I remember coming home from school and in tears. And I said, they're just so mean. And she said, my mom came from some dysfunction as well. And she made a promise to herself that she was going to do the exact opposite. She raised all of us, and just so opposite to what she experienced. And she said, Lisa, you never know what's behind someone's eyes. And that's such an incredibly powerful lesson to keep in mind. It keeps us humble.
Yeah. It's interesting too. In my day job, I work with individuals who are returning after incarceration. And, I think that there's a lot of those labels that people put on that population of, manipulative, things that not reliable, lazy, whatever it might be. And I find it really interesting if you step back and you can ask someone, those questions, those more trauma-informed questions of like, what's going on, and not focus on the past, but really focus on the future. But also at the same time, remembering that they all have a story, that every single one of them have a story. And I think we're so quick to put somebody into, there's a news story that happened. There's the headline, and then, okay, that's it. That's you. That's completely it. That thing you did is you for the rest of your life. And even on the opposite end, like the trauma that happened to me is not me for the rest of my life. The thing that person did is not them for the rest of their life. And trying to find that bridge of like, there is a way that, you can move forward. But one thing that I really love about your programming is that you don't remove that accountability piece, especially with the juvenile justice, because people who hear this might be like, well, that's no excuse, or we can't excuse these behaviors, and they still did this thing. And you're very much acknowledging that.
Oh, yeah.
Always.
For us, it's always about accountability, personal accountability. It's always about structure and boundaries.
There's just steps to getting to that. That's all.
That's it.
Yeah. So when it's interesting, we'll force someone into compliance. But when you can help them regulate and get there themselves, they'll stay there.
So much easier, right?
Right. And, you said something very important as well. It's like, yes, these can be used in everyday life. We've had fifth graders say, can I do these breathing techniques at home? And I'm sure mom and dad would love that, because these are life skills.
Mm-hmm.
These are things, there's no reason other people should put us in a dysregulated state, and only hurts ourselves, right? And so when we can stay in that more positive brain state, when we can, it's interesting when you said about those reentering the workforce who've been incarcerated and such, how can we blame people for being bad mechanics when all the tools they were given was a screwdriver? And we're saying, fix this engine.
Yeah.
It's like we give them more tools, they can be a better mechanic, right? And so that's our philosophy is let's help the systems work better.
Yeah.
Let's reinforce what already works. We look at the systems like sometimes on how we get frustrated at our laptop with all the tabs open and all of the programs, and it's working slow and it's all of these things. But imagine all of a sudden you get this external processor that can help make everything run smoother.
Yes.
That's who we are.
And teach you which tabs are safe to close.
Yes.
I think that's a big thing too.
Yeah.
For sure.
I want to ask you about, we haven't really talked about this, but I know the arts, Chip, and for you, Lisa, too, have been such important. And for you, Chip, I mean, really, the arts were your survival. That was your resilience. It's how you managed to continue. And they're such a big part of the foundation. But can I ask why Butterfly?
For sure. We'll give you the story. So, having escaped into the art and literature, especially poetry as a young person, I ended up always sort of equating the world with different metaphors, symbolism, allegories, using these tools that poets and authors use to these literary devices. And so I drive people nuts sometimes with all my metaphors. But when Lisa brought me to a very special place, now, again, we were living in Southeast Michigan. She brought me to the Detroit Zoo. If any of your viewers, listeners are familiar with it, they have a beautiful butterfly conservatory. I think they call it the Butterfly House. And, it's funny because, I wanted to see the lions or the alligators.
Right. Yeah.
And, I'm glad she brought me there because otherwise the book might have been called The Alligator Garden, which doesn't have the same soft ring. But,
Well, the Butterfly House was just so beautiful to me. And it's interesting with our programming, we have the creative art.
Yes.
We have art, we have creative writing, nature-based gardening, music, and mindful movement. And it's amazing how all of those pieces came back into our foundation. But that place brought me in such a state of peaceful, of tranquility, and I really wanted him to see the butterflies, and just in a very literal sense, right?
Well, of course, I see things in metaphors, but what was so beautiful, of course, the topiary, the water features, the big glass dome, everything was overwhelming and gorgeous. And these beautiful little creatures just flitting around, all different colors, so vulnerable. But it was the people from the youngest of children to the oldest of adult, just completely disarmed, really loving, just getting lost in this moment, being in the now. And I began to equate the world with a butterfly garden. We all know, a caterpillar devours everything around it. It consumes all the plant and whatever milkweed or whatever plant it's on. Then it goes into a chrysalis and it emerges as a butterfly. The same creature that devoured everything around it now actually pollinates.
Yeah.
Makes the world a more beautiful place. So I kind of took that cue from nature, thinking maybe we can't let our past allow us to destroy everything around us.
Oh, I love that.
But emerge with our wings and spread our wings and find a way to make the world a more beautiful place.
You can't not be mindful when you're in a butterfly house. Like, you have to look where you're going. You have to slow down. You pay attention to everything. I mean, it is such a great metaphor. And that entire idea about not allowing your past.
Yeah.
Because you're going to become a pollinator.
For sure. Well, Christal, you're a butterfly through and through.
Yes,
Thank you very much. Sometimes I think I'm an alligator. I know we touched on the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences. And, one of the things that I think, at having taken that, having done that myself and just seeing the number and being like, oh my gosh, well, there's no hope for me. I know you having that 10 out of 10 score. I have a very high score. That in itself can feel like you're doomed. But there's one thing that comes out of that factor that you had, that resilience. For me, it was, It was the arts. It was getting out of my day-to-day. It was schooling. It was this kind of thing that made me feel safe. And that resilience is the thing that I don't think we talk enough about with ACEs. I just don't think we do. And you don't want people to walk away having an ACE score of 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 and just go, well, what's the point? I guess I'm going to have a stroke in a few years. You want them to walk away with, how do we really build into that resilience? And that's really, at a base level, what all of your programming is doing is just identifying and building resilience, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Very well said.
It's not, and in fact, those who have experienced those harrowing life challenges have tools that most of us don't have.
Yeah.
And to do extraordinary things, not having the setback of fear in moments, for instance, like the exit row, who would pick to sit there, right?
Yeah.
And I'll sit there. I can react under pressure. And what we've learned in sharing our story is there's a lot of professionals out there. They've chosen their professions for a reason.
Yeah.
Something has inspired them, something in their lives. They have tools that they can use to be able to protect others, to like I said, be extraordinary.
I feel like, I've often called some of my trauma factors superpowers, because when you use them in that way, intuition, when you walk into a room and you can read people, honestly faster than you can read a menu.
Sure.
That's like, oh, I see what's going on over there. This feels safe over here. You can read that. These are really, they can be very big superpowers. And when you're talking about emergency situations, if you have the resilience and you've done enough healing, holy smokes, you are the person you want in that emergency situation who can go, okay, I'm taking over.
I got this.
When you sit in an exit row, you almost want to say, what was your ACE score? To make sure.
I want to make sure that I trust you with this. I love that resilience is built on this. I love that you're going beyond the ACE scores, because like I said, this has been around and people have been talking about this for decades now, but we need to talk more about resilience. We need to talk more about going beyond trauma informed. You have to go beyond that. You can't just know about it. You have to understand and how to react. As we're running out of time, I want to say, I just really want to get a chance for people to connect with you, because the St. Clair Butterfly Foundation is here in Michigan. It's elsewhere. You guys have grown everywhere. You are here in Michigan. You're here in Traverse City, which is like amazing. I can't believe you're here. How can people connect with you? If someone is listening to this and they're just going, yep, I'm in, how do they get in touch with you? How can people, donate, volunteer, or sign up for some of these trainings?
Yeah, for sure. Well, St. Clair Butterfly Foundation.org or scbf.org is our website.
Okay.
And there's all sorts of contact information, more information about all of our programming. And if anyone's interested, we're always looking for what we call doers, donors, and door openers.
Yes.
Maybe somebody knows the school system. Maybe you're an educator that really sees this programming working to help improve the system where you are. Maybe you work, you're a nurse, you're an RN, and you think this could be helpful for your team. You talked about this could apply to everyone. We've actually had those in the workforce. We've had local businesses say, we need this for our employees. Yep. This is HR right now. So our whole culture works better. So we're open to anything and everything. We just want to help make systems run better, help build that resilience, and help us connect better as human beings. That's
perfect. I like to end with a little bit of a lightning round. So you can just answer these questions, pretty short, gut level. But I wonder, when you're not, changing the world with the St. Clair Butterfly Foundation, what do you do in your downtime?
Oh, we love to do puzzles, jigsaw puzzles.
Okay. Oh, so you're still working.
We're still putting the pieces together.
You're still putting the pieces together. So
canoeing. We love canoeing.
Jigsaw puzzles?
Yeah, we also have a young adult career that we're writing on screenplay. So we write young adult novels
Amazing.
and screenplays in all of our free time. Yeah.
But when we need to give our eyes a rest.
And
But
all of your free time.
Traverse City in northern Michigan's been a safe place for us for many years. We moved up here in 2020. And it's just been, we've never looked back. We can't believe we're here.
Oh, I'm so excited.
And we just can't wait to continue to make a difference.
And I know that you're growing. I think the work you're doing it's beyond fundamental. I mean, it is foundational, which is why you should check out the St. Clair Butterfly Foundation, get involved. And I just have to say for both of you for sharing your personal stories, I know how much that can affect you. I know how much it takes, and it is a gift to share. So I want to thank you for sharing that. And I hope that it's helped others. So thank you for doing this work and for doing it in a way that's both compassionate, practical, because a lot of people want to help. They just don't know how to do it. This has been Currently the Conversation. It's brought to you by TVC Cherry Capital Airport, your Northern Michigan connection. Get in touch with the St. Clair Butterfly Foundation. It's super easy to find, and get involved.